Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 146. Today's guest is Olatunde Osinaike. Hey there, folks. Welcome to the show. We are starting off the 9th year of Keep the Channel Open with a conversation with poet Olatunde Osinaike. Originally from the west side of Chicago, Olatunde Osinaike is a Nigerian-American poet, essayist, and software developer. He is the author of Tenderheaded, winner of the 2022 National Poetry Series and published by Akashic Books in 2023. He's also the author of the limited edition chapbook Speech Therapy, published by Atlas Review, and the New, published by 30 West. His work has appeared in LitHub, Poetry Daily, Best New Poets, 20.35 Africa, New Poetry from the Midwest, Obsidian, and elsewhere. His work has received fellowships and support from Poets and Writers, Hurston Wright Foundation, and the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice at Rutgers University. He lives in Atlanta and would like to thank you. For today's conversation, Olatunde and I discussed his book, Tenderheaded. The poems in this collection are, as Camille Rankin puts it in the preface, playful, but not playing. The language in the poems is musical and dexterous, and you get a strong sense of that playfulness that Rankin mentions, but in the ways that the poems examine and interrogate masculinity, and specifically Black masculinity, there is a much more reflective quality to them. There's a feeling of both bravado and vulnerability, of celebration and analysis, and the contrast between the self-assuredness of the language and the way that the speaker of the poems wrestles with and eventually accepts uncertainty, well, it makes for a fascinating experience for the reader. I've put links in the show notes to purchase your own copy of Tenderheaded. There are links to 44th and 3rd booksellers in Atlanta, the Book Catapult here in San Diego, and also directly from the publisher, Akashic Books. As always, though, if there is an independent bookstore in your area, I highly recommend ordering your copy from there. Also, check the show notes for a link to Olatunde's events page. He has readings and author talks coming up in March, and you can find all of the details at olatundeosinaike.com/appearances. Finally, for subscribers to the KTCO Patreon, Olatunde gave us a reading of his poem Being Human Takes a Lot of Nerve from his chapbook Speech Therapy. There's also a new bonus mini episode available for subscribers. This month, I'm talking about small graces in the context of 2 poems that have been stuck in my head lately. The reading, the mini, and access to the full bonus audio archive is available to subscribers for just $2 per month. So if you like the show and want to support it, head to patreon.com/likewisemedia and sign up. That's patreon.com/likewisemedia, all one word. All right, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Olatunde Osinaike. So I'm really glad I had the opportunity to read this book. I think I've read it like 4 or 5 times now, prepping to talk with you. And there's a lot that I want to talk about with it, but I was hoping that we could start with a reading.
Yeah, sure. I'll read a poem from the book. You said you've read it a few times, so for me, it's a poem coming from the spoken word community. I haven't actually said it aloud as much, so I hope you allow me that grace to share that experience. The poem is entitled Poem Ending in 2 Truths and a Lie. The boy was born and raised in a downward trend. On paper, it should have been as easy as giving candy to a baby, but in reality, it was more like a blind date. We're talking exit strategies, sub-zero winters, and a wealth gap where he had the good with the bad, the nursery rhymes and the crash course, the pilot and the discontinued, how to keep up appearances and expensive taste, 1994. It was then the boy learned the price had gone up and will despite his grievances. It was then the boy recognized his quick feet, his steady bidding. The shortest pencil is better than the longest memory. The idea of dying for something you believe in, not unlike the idea of making a name for yourself. Celebrity, celerity, sincerity, charity. clarity, or other. So the boy signed the leg of a friend cocooned in plaster. So the boy made bracelets that broke like friendship with contact contracts it destruction. So the boy was granted sneak peeks into what it is that is expendable. 1994. It was the year he learned people still lived in black and white. In the years since, the boy clung and clung to the former, glowed in the dark. No easy feat to grind, grin, grip, gripe, grit, to spin, split, spit, sit, sift, to shun, shunt, hunt, hint, hinder, to lie, 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 live, lie. It is tainted. It is impeccable. You sing America the Beautiful. He sang America the Red Flag. You think American. He asks, am I America? America? At its best, adjective. At its worst, adverb. The boy, yet a part of speech as tense as time.
Thank you. It's so interesting to hear you read this aloud and to consider how the sound of it in your voice and the way that you read it is sort of different than how I read it on the page. Mm-hmm. Because so this poem, like in form, it's sort of like a prose poem. It's not like a lineated poem. It's just one big block of justified text. Right. And when I read that on the page, it has a certain, whenever I see a poem that looks like that on the page, to me, it has this sort of like almost relentless kind of like forward motion to it. Like it feels fast to me. Mm-hmm. And yet the way that you read it here is much more sort of almost tentative, softer, slower. Mm-hmm. And it makes a really interesting contrast from my original experience of the poem, which is actually something that I kind of wanted to talk about because there is such a strong musicality to your poems throughout this collection. There is so much in these poems where you use a lot of assonance, slant rhyme, alliteration. Like it's a real sonic experience. Mm-hmm. And much of that is most apparent to the ear. Mm-hmm. And yet there are also word choices and meanings that can only be apparent to the eye, where you're using like homonyms, or, you know, the form of a poem may be, it's not exactly like concrete poetry, but like just the way that it looks on the page is giving you something that you can't really articulate through voice. You mentioned that you came up through spoken word. I know you came up through the Vanderbilt spoken word when you were an undergrad there. Yeah. And so it has made sense to me that, you know, knowing that information, that the poems would have such a strong sort of sonic quality to them. Mm-hmm. This use of sound and cadence to create a sonic experience makes a lot of sense in that. But like, I'm really interested in the ways that the poem can live differently in the ear and in the eye, if that makes sense. And I was wondering how do you think about that sort of contrast?
Yeah, that's interesting you put it that way. I think as I've been reading poems, and honestly, I don't know that I've gone through the entire book, like having read it since it's been out in the world, and have had the same experience, you know, coming from the spoken word community. I think the challenge for me always is still, I think just my instinct still lies in the vocality of it. You know, I think of a quote from Czesław Miłosz, which is, I think it's like the purpose of poetry. I may be butchering it overall, but the purpose of poetry is to remind us how difficult it is to remain just one person. Mm. And you mentioned, you know, the senses, both the eye and the ear. And I think even when I read my poems, read other poetry from maybe folks I know or otherwise don't, I commend that ability to like shed what the expectation is, what it looks like on the page. And even with experimentation on the page, it surprises me when I read the poem, when breath chooses it to inhabit space more than I probably expected to, which is to say, you know, I'm a big lover of enjambment, but that doesn't necessarily say that I mean that every time I see a line break, my body, considering the momentum of it, does the same with that momentum. It may be a longer pause, it may not be. And with the book being broken down into 3 sections, and I'll give you this tidbit. I grew up in kind of choral music. So I was a bit of a singer growing up. It's like music is so much about the gaps as it is about like what's said, or what's done. And so I'm thinking a lot about that censorship, that what you can do. I could trick myself all day almost,
Yeah. There's a thing that you said just now about expectation. And to me, that is such an integral part of the collection, is this sense of what does someone expect of a person, and how is that perhaps the same or different from who that person is or who that person wants to be. It's interesting to hear you talk about that in the context of the poems as well. But I feel like, so these poems are so much about, or so many of them are so much about masculinity and manhood, and specifically Black masculinity and manhood. Although I think that there are things that are probably common to the experience of manhood across many communities. And one of those things that I feel like is perhaps an integral part of American manhood writ large is this thing about expectation, about what a man is supposed to be. That comes up over and over again in these poems. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. When I think of particularly American manhood, I think so much of that modality is we could probably ascribe to idolizing our own censorship, or making an idol out of censorship in general. What our position is can be both a bizarre one and a couched one. So I'm thinking a lot about, there's a quote, and it has to do with poetry, but I think about it, I kind of think about it in terms of my attributes. Van Jordan says like the poem is smarter than the poet, and that poems often use poets as host bodies, but may not even particularly care about what happens to the poet in a man's world, where so much can be of privilege to having that identification, to be able to kind of weaponize that. I think of this whole experience of having this book out to the world. I don't particularly separate my own voice from the work in here. Having it out there, I think of it like a museum, where most museums, you don't want to touch the things on the wall, but this book is a museum of memory, which I'm almost welcoming to touch, to have, the multiplicity of fingerprint or experience and takeaway. And you can't really control that, though I have, I tread expectation in my own way. I cower in my own way. I have my own safety mechanisms. So I'm thinking about how so often patriarchy lends itself to progressive disclosure. If I tell you only the things that I feel comfortable telling you, then I don't have to expose the parts of myself that maybe are incoherent or dodgy, So I think that's none of us here present created it, but we lean into it, or have at least had the experience of leaning into some of those formalities. And so I'm thinking about that deceit and what it can mean for this book to walk down a path of having more courage than I have had before. The uncontrollable, right? That I don't know where this book will go. And even like being able to, I can have a reading and it's in concert. I can tell, I can predict, if you will, what will be said. But when I'm not there, when I'm not present, what does it say of those experiences? What does it say of agency then?
There's something that you said at the beginning of that response there that kind of sparked something for me that I hadn't really considered before. This idea of masculinity as a celebration of censorship, because censorship is a phenomenon that involves silence and the silencing of people. And I don't know if maybe this is something that I'm making a connection that's too much of a reach. I don't know, but there is something about the idea of censorship as silence, but that, you were just talking a minute ago about in music and in poetry that the pauses, the silences around the words or around the notes being something that makes meaning or impact or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. And so, like, I don't know exactly where I'm going with this. Like I said, I hadn't thought of this before, but there's something about the silence of the sort of censorship or even self-censorship and the silences in terms of poetic or musical rests that is doing something in my brain. And I'm not sure I can quite put my finger on it, but I thought maybe I'll throw this at you and see if it sparks anything.
Well, it's interesting, for me, I'm thinking, when you say that, I'm thinking about a lot, but particularly, and we're going to get to this probably a bit later, just music. So there's an artist, Smino, which at the time of writing this book, which started probably around 2018. So a period of about 5 years. And I also kind of disclose, I do software development. So I'm often thinking about how to parse information. So often conversation around the software, and not just the software itself, is steeped in a binariness. So it's, if we're thinking about music with or without sound, you can layer it, but it's going to be with or without sound. And so I'm thinking about how to attain a sense of maybe the idea of like being rushed versus feeling something is urgent or immediate. Yeah, I don't know. I think the pauses themselves are the most treasured part about reading a poem. The blank stare, the blank part of a page. It's what troubles, but it's, as they say in poetry, it creates the heat. But I think especially with this collection, if I might say, a number of poems are connected to pop culture, and there may be a pattern of the songs that I choose to listen to, or I have chosen to listen to, because they present the comfort to not have to say anything, or to, if you, even there are lyrics that you can nod along to, and you may not agree with them, but you're nodding, you're listening, you're present, you're involved, you're with that. So like even the nonchalance of agreement, the insisted upon contracts that happen with music, I think pauses can present an interesting challenge in terms of intervention versus what we circumvent. So yeah, I think that might stay with me for a while, because I'm trying to even, that it could be a bit troubling, like that inside voice and what you choose to steer toward and away from.
I think that is a thing, like what you're choosing to steer towards or away from, what you're choosing to intervene or circumvent. It seems like a central question of the collection. And honestly, it seems like a central question, not just of like manhood, but of personhood, of like how to be a person in the world. Mm-hmm. And I think that there is something that is like, I think a lot of these poems, and perhaps the collection as a whole, are like the word that you used when you were describing software development, which, if we're disclosing stuff, like I'm not a software developer, but I am an electrical engineer and I do write a lot of code. Mm-hmm. So this question of parsing, and like literally you already know this obviously, but for a listener, in the context of software, or for parsing, we're taking some input and trying to find patterns or make meaning out of it, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like this function of parsing is at the center of many of these poems, of asking this question: what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be Black? What does it mean to be a Black man? What does it mean to be an American Black man? What does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to be in love? And to sort of connect this to something else that I've been thinking a lot about, because you mentioned that there are a lot of pop culture references in this.
Yeah.
There are a lot of pop culture references, and some of them are to movies, some of them are to television, some of them are to music. There are also a lot of references to religion and to church
Mm-hmm.
in the poems, and whether that be sort of allusions to biblical stories or specific language or descriptions of scenes that might be in a church or things like that. And one of the things that I was thinking a lot about was this idea of like, how do we learn to be a person? How do we learn to be a man? How do we learn to be the thing that we like? Identity is in so many ways a relational thing. Like, we are, like, what we think of ourselves is so much to do with how we relate to the categories that we're in.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do we learn what those categories mean, whether that's American or man or Black man or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this idea of how we learn these things, these ideas of perhaps having mentors and who those mentors might be, whether it's the people that we have in our life specifically, whether it's the people that we see through the culture that we take in, or institutions like church or school or things like that, seems like a really important part of this sort of general questioning and parsing that these poems are doing. Can we talk about that?
Yeah. I want to touch on something you said earlier. You mentioned, the poem I read, it has a prose, left justified, that's its form. And
Mm-hmm.
so I remember even in conversation with the publisher, a number of the poems I found to be a bit dirty, like they needed to be cleaned up, edited. And when writing the book, I'm often thinking even in retrospect, but then it was so important to me to distinguish the imperfections of a poem. Like, there are certain poems I've left in there, and they've been edited and combed through, but there could be an occupation made out of that, of imitating or trying to resemble. And I think, like, with a number of the poems, I'm thinking about the significance of what it might mean for a kid like myself and, and youth to see an attempt and not so much think immediately, readily kind of think of or attach that to an aesthetic, but rather like stay with the attempt itself. We're talking about parsing code. And honestly, so often the most important part of code is not really the functions. It's like the comments you add, to provide context, yeah. Right? Like, it's sure there's importance to the system and to the container, but in any, manner of version control, it's important to honor the rules of engagement, like honor where you were when you wrote that portion that you're introducing into new branch, or, what it was that you were interrogating at the time you elected to use a subset of, or deploy a subset of code. And so for me, I'm thinking about with the book, it's an intersection specifically, a tie-in of patriarchy, those privileges, but also my Blackness and the mitigated nature, of trying to understand that decision tree of, I did this when I was younger and now I do this. Why is that? What was it that I was trying to replicate, that I was trying to imitate? And so I'm trying to find new ways to instigate like gentleness throughout the collection, while also not growing too weary in the fact that how I digest the world around me will remain imperfect. Like how I ascertain position and value or ascribe value to an image, a memory, it's going to be entrenched, and readily so, and it'll just be unsatisfying to me. It'll be thorny, and if I'm true to that pilgrimage back to self, which was the goal, if you're thinking about even the term tender-headed, it's not to prescribe that elusive journey as something that there has been a destination found, but rather, all these attempts are still just attempts. And as I said before, the poem can make something anew in the writer. And I'm finding that myself, it being published or not, wandering around that bend. So yeah, parsing, who am I to say, like, I have all the functions that can make this to be a less expensive journey, to put it in a computational sense.
Hmm.
Yeah.
It strikes me that, when we're talking about what you replicate or what are you trying to imitate or things like that, the poetry is like a form that particularly does engage with that, because poetic forms are so often things that we do receive, whether it might be, sonnets or whatever, or even if we're not talking about particular like closed forms, just that the medium of poetry is one in which, especially, at this point in the history of the world, so much of what we are doing, like, even if we're just like, well, are we going to use couplets or tercets or intersperse tercets and couplets? Are we going to have a big block of text? Like any of these things are things that we've already seen other people do. And we learn we learn to even call this poetry because somebody else called it poetry. And yet it doesn't feel like just a repetition, even when we're explicitly in conversation with other poets and poems. Like, for example, the last poem in this collection, On Cue, is after Etheridge Knight's poem, which is The Sun Came, and that is after Gwendolyn Brooks's poem, Truth.
Yeah.
And yet, what I found so interesting, I wasn't familiar with either of those poems before I started researching to talk to you. Obviously, I know who Gwendolyn Brooks is, but I didn't know that particular poem.
Yeah.
And one of the things that just struck me so much about these three poems is that each one of them, like, even though they are connected to each other, they don't feel the same. They don't look the same on the page. They don't have the same voice. And in some ways, I kind of feel like they're not even really rhetorically trying to do the same things. So even though we have this sort of, I don't know, imitation is not quite the right word, but something that we've received from someone else, we're still doing something new with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking like that sweater that's been passed through different generations, knitted by your grandmother, and you pass it along to a cousin, and they don't really know where it came from. They just know it's fly. Like lineage, I thought it particularly important to end the book with the poem Steeped in Lineage. I remember when I wrote it, I was thinking a lot about, there's an interview, I think it's often shared with between Gwendolyn, and Paul Angle, I believe it was, in like the 60s. And was asking her like about her promise to poetry, and like thinking through the influences that occur in like creative environments. And Miss Brooks mentions Walt Whitman, and she's thinking about like a quote he mentions where I think it's Whitman's desire to like vivify the contemporary effect. And then, Brooks spins that to say, what does it mean for one to possibly vilify the universal fact? I like to think of that in terms of lineage when we're reflecting upon my own practice of writing. As poems came and went with this collection, I was thinking about my own reliance upon like function, the nasty urges I have, or connections I have to capitalism, to all isms, right? Thinking through latitude to explore my own theme, my own want for economy, besides or as an aside to estrangement, and how I deliberate and think of my own language. So I don't know, I think that's a lot to say, more than a lot, really kind of spinning more so into like the debt I owe to poetry for the detours. And I appreciate that they don't maybe feel that similar, at least On Cue and The Sun Came, and because I would think more about the imperfections and like what the tells are in my own poetry that could or could not relate to, I have to think like, okay, there's no algorithm like my heart. There's no uncanny valley that will keep me there forever. So just thinking about movement, if no one ever does take anything out of the book, it'd be that they knew that there was a Gwendolyn Brooks that influenced this poem, this little spot in this book, and move forward, you know? So
I don't, I don't want to get too sort of like, psychoanalytic, I suppose. But it's really striking me as we're talking that like a lot of the responses that you're giving me are very, self-analytical, which is also a thing that comes through in the poems. And this thing that you just said about being indebted to these other people, and I don't want to read too much into, anything, but like there's a certain tentativeness to the way you worded it and the way you said it. And what strikes me when I'm thinking about this collection, especially when I'm thinking about the whole arc of it, right? You've got 3 sections. I would say sort of like they're called tenor, tremolo, and forte. These are all musical terms. Tenor brings to mind youth for me. And indeed, many of the poems in the first section seem to be about youth. Tremolo brings to mind the word tremulous, or like something that is shaking, something that is in peril, perhaps. And indeed, many of the poems that are in that section are about sort of the dangers of Black manhood in America.
Yeah. And
the word forte in music specifically means loud, but it more broadly means strong. I feel like there is this, the arc of the book, if we come from like the very first poem that's even before the first section, which is called Men Like Me, right? Yeah. It has a tone that's a lot more sort of declarative in what I think of as like the sort of voice of spoken word poetry, both in how it appears on the page and in its diction. Whereas the last poem, On Cue, has this sort of tentativeness to it, which is to me really interesting, that many of the poems in the forte section, the section that is titled for strength, strength being an adjective that we associate with manhood, right? And yet many of the poems in this section have the poems have way fewer declarations and a lot more questions. And even the last image that we have in the last poem is of a trust fall, which is like an inherently like vulnerable activity. And then even moving into the sort of afterword, right? The acknowledgements, the beginning of the acknowledgements, first sentence is, if it isn't clear yet, I am still on my way. To me, that this is like a really, it's an interesting way to push back against what manhood is supposed to be. And then, if we take this in the context of a collection that is called Tender-Headed, which is a phrase that, as far as I can find, doesn't actually appear in any of the poems, but we can't get away from this idea of tenderness, right? There's something about indebtedness to other people that implies a certain vulnerability to me. And yet, what is a community if not a group of people who are all interdependent, which is to say we all rely on each other within this community, and we are all vulnerable to each other, and yet we all take care of each other. And it really feels to me like this is where the strength of the collection, but perhaps also the strength of personhood comes in. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think, well, I appreciate your read of the book, because I've never heard it told back to me in that way. And yeah, I think that if there were a point of a book, it'd be to steer someone in a direction. And I'm not much for takeaways, but if I were, I appreciate your takeaway. I mentioned choral music, and all 3 of the sections do point back to music in the way that you mentioned it. I think so much of manhood, or the era where I felt closest in proximity to the aesthetic of manhood, was probably when I was the most unclear about what it was I was achieving with that manhood. To even say you are a man, like it can feel so declarative, but it doesn't really mean too much other than like your awareness, or to label yourself as having perceived what that would incorporate, almost an inflammatory nature. And so, I think the book is stemming from probably that era or that astigmatism that happens with objectifying what value exists in personhood, and really the true value that comes from being unclear, being uncertain. I think that the Black narrative is many things, and not the least of which is assumed. And so if I'm thinking about like what resistance could look like in terms of fighting for your personhood past the point of well-intentioned, well-mannered steps, I think to give testimony in a true way would mean to spill out in the ways that you not have really fallen short, but rather like you're still unclear. So, I'm thinking about, I think there are poems in tenor that are uncertain, that have a curtain. I'm thinking of poems in tremolo and in forte. They all, there are points throughout the book where I don't want it to ever feel like, and I'm not sure that this is even significant, but I don't know that the boy nor I really know where we're going. And that's cool too. So yeah, so much of what I should say is not what I want to. And I'm cool with that too.
That is just a really interesting thing to say. With so much of what I should say is not what I want to. I don't know. It strikes me that, well, I mean, you're much younger than I am from what I gather. I'm going to be 45 this year.
I'm closer than you think.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't know, but we'll see. We'll chat about it later.
Okay. But, I mean, my experience of life has been that the older I get, the less things seem certain to me, both in terms of like precarity, but also in terms of my understanding of things. It's not to say that there aren't still things in my life that I can say, that I can make a declaration, yes, this is right, yes, this is wrong.
Yeah.
There are still things like that. But just in general, that my life has moved into shades of gray more than it was when I was young, when things seemed more binary, which is, of course, exactly what my mother always told me was going to happen when I got older. But, and it's interesting to hear you say that you're not really you're not much for takeaways, but, you're also talking about giving testimony. And I think that there is something about that oftentimes, especially when it comes to art, it is the work that is less declarative, that feels more true and useful. I think useful is a little bit of a crass word when it comes to art. It makes it feel a little transactional, but I think that, I guess what I mean is that we take in art, and that the experience of taking art in, the experience of experiencing art and the value of art is, simply put, that it does something for you, that it makes you feel a certain thing that you find meaningful. It may answer questions for you, or it may simply make you aware that other people are grappling with the same questions as you are. And sometimes the questions themselves, or the existence of the questions as questions, can be as much an answer as something more definite.
Yeah.
So there's something, I don't know. It's just really interesting to hear this sort of push and pull, I guess, between, what's the thing that I want to say and what's the thing I should say? What's the thing that I don't really necessarily, I'm not trying to impart some kind of a moral, and yet there are still things that people may find meaningful in a moral way. I don't know. I guess this isn't so much a question, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I'm thinking about, I think so much of art, if I can speak freely, is probably more of an exercise in impermanence. Every day we have the chance to opt in to play or really drill. And either can appear like care, and either can appear like Black. My cousin asked me recently about like my next piece of art, like what I'll be working on next. I blurted out like myself. because I don't really, I don't, I don't know what it might mean to create another piece of art without working on self. And it's so not bizarre, you know. I don't think art should be put into a position to placate, and that strain would be probably most felt in the artist's gaze. Perhaps they mishandle or misrepresent what the work was meant to do, and what the work was attempting to do outside of the artist. So, you know, that's kind of why I always turn back to the imperfection. You know, it need not be familiar for even going back to the idea of a universal fact, like that it's to say that there is some universal way to receive or provide is a bit warped, because we're already living in a warped sense. So, you know, if we show up to each other with our truest sense of community, placing community forward or ahead of ourselves, then who am I to give an answer to something like, what is my next piece of art? What I will be doing next? If, you know, it's the Tyson quote. It's, everybody has a plan until they're punched in the mouth. Like, there's not really any other route for us to take.
Well, there's like a whole bunch of other stuff. Like, I've got like 6 pages of notes here, but I think, why don't we take a little break?
All right.
And we'll come back and do the second segment.
Yeah.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
So recently, somewhat recently, I guess, André 3000 came out with a album, New Blue Sun, and I've been spinning that on repeat for some time. You know, even that question, what is a universal fact? I think, and even, you know, thinking through our conversation just recently about expectation, and thinking about how we can or opt to clothe ourselves differently depending on the audience. And so I appreciated what is, I believe, termed as the departure album, departing from the gaze or expectation, that comfort zone, if it can be termed that. In a professional sense, I really admired, but also in a personal sense, I think that shedding is such an experience, particularly because of the effort that we put toward performance. It's like a cardinal rule. I'm thinking, you know, just departure albums in general. There's a number of them. There are some that stand out to me particularly, like, you know, there's Lil Wayne's Rebirth, which is like mostly rock. And at the time he's, you know, primarily seen as a rap artist. And then, you know, you don't have to experience departures after having like set foot or provided the mud from which people stand and set in stone. You know, I'm thinking about De La Souls, which I love the group, but they're 3 Feet High and Rising, which was one of their first albums. T-Pain, like Rapper Turned Singer, which, you know, even the titular reminds us of transformation. You know, I'm coming into this, even if it's not my perception, it is someone's perception that I should be a rapper, but I am singing. And, you know, his whole career, even now, like a lot of it's kind of, oh, I didn't know he could sing like that. He always sang with auto-tune, like The Mask and what that provides, what that detachment provides, or rather even like what does it mean to be dislocated from what is perceived about you? That's something I've been thinking about a lot recently. Yeah.
It's such an interesting thing. I mean, just to go back to this André 3000 album, it really is a departure. I mean, here's a guy that is known so much for being a lyricist.
Yeah.
I mean, just for anybody who isn't familiar with it, it's like, it's an album of like instrumental flute music, and a lot of it is very ambient sounding. I saw some little clips of interviews going around when the album first dropped of him saying stuff like, well, what am I going to rap about? Like going to the grocery store or something, like, because he's getting older now.
Yeah. And
it's always an interesting thing, this contention between like, oh God, I can't even remember who it was, but there was, I think it was, it might have been like Lemmy, you know, somebody asking him like, if he ever gets tired of playing Ace of Spades. And he's like, yeah, but like, you know, people show up and they want to hear the hits, so you can play it for them. And, you know, actually, you know, it wasn't somebody like that. It was somebody else. And they were saying like, do you ever get tired of playing this thing? And he was like, yeah, but if I went to a Motorhead concert and they didn't play Ace of Spades, I'd be pissed off too. Which, I don't know, there's just something about that that's so interesting to like then have somebody like Andre 3000 just like really go in a different direction.
Yeah.
And like, I would imagine that there's probably people who found this new album to be really vexing or flummoxing, you know? But to me, that there's something, I don't know, there's something really, I don't know, admirable or like inspiring about just doing the thing that you want to do, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess that kind of even goes back to the thing we were just talking about like the thing that I want to say and the thing that I feel like I should say. That sometimes we don't say the thing that we want to say because we're afraid of the consequences. And sometimes that's a good thing because maybe the consequence is that we hurt somebody that we don't want to hurt. But like a lot of times the things that we're afraid of saying, the thing that we shouldn't say, but that we do want to say, has less to do with hurting people and more a fear of the way that people regard us might change. And being able to just go out there and do it anyway, I feel like requires a certain amount of courage that not everybody has. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You know, I'm thinking it takes so much to be exuberant about yourself. And, you know, I really admire, as you mentioned, that deep-seated quality, that voyeuristic quality that I think we all have. They say, oh, well, when you're older, you'll return back to your kid-like qualities. And when you're a kid, you have it then. But basically, at the in-between, you're just SOL. Like, I guess, you know, just still within to kind of come back around. And to see, like, that exercise, or at least be a witness of that exercise in someone else's journey, it does move you. You know, it is quite something to be adamant about. You know, I'm even thinking about, and this is more recent, American Fiction, that came out recently, and like its relationship to another film, blanking. Oh, yep, Who Cloned Tyrone, and that was on Netflix. But both, you know, touching on aspects of perhaps inward-facing surrealism. You know, there's moments of blaxploitation. There's moments of sociological cardinality, and just like really getting at the pigeonholing that is so, it's everywhere, you know, it feels inevitable at times, really. And so I can see New Blue Sun being, without words, right, without explanation, being something that frees you, and seeing the exercise kind of take hold of another one's spirit, especially mine. Obviously I brought it up, but I think that that's quite something.
Yeah. I always think that it's interesting to consider things like that. There was a word you used a minute ago that, you know, being a witness to someone's journey artistically, that, you know, going off in a completely new direction. I mean, I guess there's some question about whether making music that's in a totally different genre is in a completely different direction because it's still music.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's pretty radically different music. And I feel like when you're in the audience, there's a way of seeing the art as sort of like an endpoint, you know, rather than as a product of a person who is, you know, while they're still alive, they're not at an endpoint. And I mean, also being able to take that as sort of separate from whether or not this new different work is successful.
Yeah.
What it even means for work to be successful or good, right? I know there are definitely, like, I've listened to that album a couple times myself, and I found it interesting. It didn't always completely do it for me, but I thought that it was like, you know, there's definitely moments in this I'm like, yeah. And there are, you know, I read some reviews of it, and some people are like really into it, and some people are like, I don't like this. And it's kind of hard to sometimes separate, like, if I don't like this, or even if I do like it, how much of that is because of the fact that it's different from what came before?
Mm-hmm.
You know, because there is the through line of the same artist, it's hard not to make the comparison and to take something completely on its own terms, which I'm not sure you can ever fully do because everything exists in a context.
Yeah.
But I think that being able to risk failure is such an important thing for an artist to be able to do, you know, because otherwise you can't grow. Like if you're only doing things that are easy for you, then it doesn't require you to gain new skills or improve the skills that you already have. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And where's the pursuit in that? I'd like to think the risk of, put it this way, I was listening to an interview recently with Tristan Harris, who's like a tech ethicist. I'm sure you've heard of probably.
I have not.
No? Okay. So like Laws of UX, he's part of the group that, you know, we're thinking about like tech ethics, like Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, thinking about like the infinite scroll. And he was talking about how basically the incentive of the attention economy and really like monopolizing one's attention is so much built upon how precise they can pinpoint your want. You know, the nearness heuristic where it's like I'm scrolling. And if I can see just a glimpse of this new post at the bottom of my phone or tablet, I'll probably scroll because I want to complete something. That's like the inherent, usually a typical desire of humanity. Like we have a desire to complete, you know, something that's probably 80%, 90% there. And so I'm thinking about, I don't know, I'm thinking about like what it means to be a consumer of the art and be what I am after I've consumed. You mentioned like failure and success. And so much of that can even obscure the real heart of art or behind underwrites art, which is so much so tied to the attempt. Like they were one place and now the art has moved them forward to or behind or elsewhere. Even if it doesn't connect with you, that's not to say that it isn't something worth connecting to for someone. But yeah, you know, I mean, I'm thinking about even like in the album, I agree. There's some songs I'm like, not so much for me. And then there's moments that just ring and are so special because it almost feels at times I can sense that how close he allows us to be to his attempt. Like you can hear it, you know, in the wind instrument when it's just like fluttering and you don't really know if it's flat or sharp, the note. But it's really there. Like it's full bodied. It's present and it's not censored, which, you know, even tying back to what we've been talking about, which I have to appreciate. Yeah.
Yeah. So the last question that I always like to end with is if there's a piece of art or literature or creativity that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
You know, what's interesting, the reason I had thought about, or I guess a thread there, Ryan Johnson, who's producer of American Fiction and also director of like some murder mysteries. So I've been really into comical murder mysteries. The Knives Out film, I rewatched with my sister-in-law, who she just seen it for the first time, and my wife, and seeing their faces as they, you know, as the gears go, and try to put together like what just happened, or it's happening in front of them has been quite a delightful experience for me. It's something small, but it meant a lot because I am, I guess, a kind of a person for spoilers, and that I guess identify in that crowd, but it means a lot to see them have that experience for the first time, like for something new to stain them in that way. Yeah, so I guess that's something that comes to mind for sure.
Yeah, that is always a wonderful thing, especially if it's something that. Actually, I'm not sure which is better, like experiencing something like that for the first time together, or watching somebody else experience something for the first time that you've already experienced. Those are both pretty great.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, if one wins, it's going to be a close win. I'll give you that. So.
Yeah. Well, listen, I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you for having me, Mike.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, there are links in the show notes to purchase your own copy of Tender-Headed, as well as to Olatunde's upcoming events page, where you can find all the details about his upcoming author talks and readings. Do check those out. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, the music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help is by Shay Aguinaldo. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please consider supporting the show by making a pledge at patreon.com/likewisemedia or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. There are links in the show notes for all of that. And you can find all of the show's contact information, transcripts, and show notes on our website at keepthechanneleopen.com. That's all for now. We'll be back next month with a new conversation, and until then, remember, keep the channel open.